But leading off today is roles and responsibilities, and that's critically important for school committees, especially new members, to understand what their responsibilities are. State law has some specifics as to what you can and cannot do, and assign certain things to superintendents as well. 4 years ago, the legislature enacted a reform package that included site-based management, so now you also have school principals that are involved with a lot of the decision-making at the school level. So we have Ben Scungio. Ben's an old friend. When I first started working with him, I had nice dark black hair. But he is a senior member in his law firm. He's worked with school committees and education nonprofits for the better part of 35, 40 years. With him is Sean Clough, who is also with the Providence office. Sean has the distinction of working with us as a former school committee member in the Smithfield School District. So I'm going to turn it over to them. They've got a presentation here. I think you'll find it very helpful and very beneficial. So without further ado, Sean and Ben, the day is yours.
Thank you, Tim. Sean Clough and I, along with 3 other attorneys in our office, John Anderson, Ron Cascioni, and Laurie Miller, represent school committees and their interests. And that became a specialty of our firm originally when we started to represent North Providence 37 years ago. And we all kind of fell in love with the area. We fell in love with what school committee people do. So we just continue to develop and expand and continue to work in that area, and we kind of love it. Things that attorneys can do are pretty broad, but our group decided to focus in this area. Although we do practice in other areas, it's principally what we do, your interests. When Sean came to our firm 3 years ago, I knew him in a previous life when he was not only on the Smithfield School Committee, but also Sean was the chair of the Smithfield School Committee, the youngest chair that Smithfield ever had. So when he comes to us with experience, not only as an attorney, but also with that knowledge of what it's like to sit behind that bench, to take those questions, to lead committees. So he comes with a different kind of experience that other attorneys in our office do as well. So hopefully that's helpful to you if you have questions for him along the way. Feel free to ask us questions. We don't mind. We're here for an hour. We're here till 9:45. Obviously, we can't talk about everything we'd like to in that time period, but we thought what we do is we kind of settled on 5 areas we wanted to talk to you about. Judy has sent you a link to the back of a back page to our website, and on it there's a copy of all the materials. Also connected to it, there's also a package of statutes with different areas highlighted that kind of reference the areas in this presentation that we talked about. If you can't get to that area for any reason, you can always send me an email or give me a call or Sean, and we're happy to send that information to you. Also, Judy has a copy of it as well, so she could send it to you digitally as well. So if you'd like this information as a resource, we're happy to have it. Okay? So let's get started. First question I have is, how many people here are first-time school committee members? Okay. So now, more important question, how many people here as school committee member are in your 2nd or 3rd term? So the people with their hands up now, as a first-time school committee member, if you have a question, they're a great resource for you in your association. And if for some reason you feel uncomfortable asking a question to somebody on your own committee, in your association, you could seek out somebody with experience and ask them, as well as Tim. And you'll find that there's a great well of advice and wisdom that this association holds. And I think it's probably their strength, greatest strength, beyond advocacy at legislation. So feel free to do that. You should do that. Also, if you have a general question anytime you want to give us a call, you can. You should always call your own legal counsel first. But if there's some kind of issue you want to discuss with us, just between us, that's fine. We're happy to do that. Okay, so let's get started. We hope that you will reflect on a couple of questions as we make our way through this presentation and going forward. And those questions basically is, what is my job as a school committee person? What powers and responsibilities do I have, which is the main focus of our presentation today? What are my goals? I need to clarify them. Very often you run and you kind of create a narrative in your campaign of the things you want to do or the things you want to change. But once you get in and you actually get seated as a school committee person, you're going to quickly find out that what you've seen on the outside isn't what's really true on the inside. You get access to a lot more facts and a lot more data, and that helps you define the things that you want to do and define what your goals are as an elected member of a committee. Then you want to know, how do my goals fit within the committee's goals? And one of the themes throughout our presentation is you are not elected to an administrative position. You are not elected to a position like a mayor. You were elected to a committee. That's why we call it school committee. So in order to function properly, you have to figure out how you act within the context of a committee. And that has profound ramifications, because your opinion as a single opinion doesn't mean very much. If you can't count to the number of the majority in your school committee, and you can't get that number of people to follow you, you can have any idea in the world, it's not going to go anywhere, right? So you have to consider that all the time as a school committee member. And that leads to the last question: how do I accomplish anything in the end? And so if you can clarify your goals, they fit within the context of the committee's goals, that's going to lead you down a path on how you can get those goals accomplished. A couple of bullet points that we're going to go through in a lot more detail. School committees are created by the General Assembly. Some of you get to that seat and you think a deity created that position, and somehow you've become a semi-deity. Really not true. The fact that the General Assembly created you means the General Assembly can destroy you. It means that the General Assembly can make rules and regulations by which you have to live. And those become the rules of the game, and we have to get used to that. School committee's power also is limited by various federal and state laws, which your superintendent will help you with, which your chairman will help you with, and which your legal counsel will help you with. But keep in mind, you're constrained in many, many different ways. And you have to understand where those boundaries are in order to live within them and to understand what you can accomplish and what you can't accomplish. I have two numbers there, 493 and 3473. So none of you know what those mean. So right now in Rhode Island, there are 493 separate statutes that affect school committees. There are now 3,473 individual cases, either in Superior Court or Supreme Court, that affect or describe or circumscribe your authority as a school committee member. So if you don't like being told what to do, you ran for the wrong position, right? There are a lot of people out there that tell you what to do and how to do your job, and a lot of them have this power over you, and you have to pay attention to them to be successful. And remember, and we hear this very often, an individual will come to us, school committee member, and say, I don't like that rule, or I don't like that policy, or I'm not going to follow it. And we always say, remember the oath that you took when you took that office. You have a responsibility, and your personal integrity is tied on the fact that you have to enforce the rules of the state of Rhode Island. So always keep that in mind, because that becomes your backstop. In terms of if your goal runs contrary to a law, your obligation is to try to change the law. It's not to disregard the law.
The General Assembly. And where does the General Assembly derive its power from? From the people as enacted through the Constitution. So the Rhode Island State Constitution, Article 12, Section 1, clearly states the duty of the General Assembly to promote schools and libraries. And it has the authority to adopt all means which it may deem necessary and proper to secure to the people the advantages and opportunities of education. So there's nice flowery language here in the Constitution, but the point here is that the General Assembly is the driver of education throughout the state.
And the Supreme Court has, in a number of cases, said that that language is so expansive that how much education students get in this state and the quality of the education that they get in the state by and large, is simply determined by what the General Assembly thinks is appropriate. Now, your association for several years, along with others, have tried to define the rights that students and parents have in terms of education. Every year, there's a valiant lobby attempt to try to change the Constitution a bit, but so far, this is the language that we have, so this is the language that we have to live with.
And so another way to explain that dynamic.
They got it.
Yeah. So the General Assembly is, Dr. Victor Frankenstein, or Steen, as the joke goes, and you all are the monster. So you're created by the General Assembly and a creature of the state, and you have to abide by the rules set by the General Assembly. So your powers are on loan. As Ben mentioned, these powers can be taken away, they can be modified, circumscribed, but also the Rhode Island Department of Education is created by the General Assembly, and its powers are on loan. Furthermore, the superintendent of schools and principals have statutory powers, statutory responsibilities that they need to abide by that is separate and apart from school committee powers. They have an independent statutory obligation to follow those rules, regardless of what you as a school committee or even as a school committee majority believe ought to happen. So for instance, the Rhode Island Department of Ed has the authority to issue regulations. They issue those regulations. The superintendent has the administrative responsibility to make sure that those regulations are implemented. You don't agree with those regulations, you have a philosophical disagreement with them. Your option is not to tell the superintendent to not abide by those regulations. Your option is really to speak with RIDE or speak with the General Assembly and advocate for maybe a rules change. But it is not your authority as a school committee member or a majority of a school committee to tell the superintendent not to abide by either state law or those regulations. Same goes for principals. And the General Assembly will be making new rules all the time.
It's an unfortunate fact of life that they do. And as you know, that they're pressured by different types of groups. They're pressured by your group in a positive way. They're pressured by the Rhode Island Superintendents Association in a positive way. Then they're pressured by a number of entities that have a particular point of interest or a particular point of view on education, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. Then they're also pressured by our union colleagues. You can decide whether that's positive or negative yourself, but very often we've been involved in cases. We've won a case about what a statute means, and then we find out next year General Assembly has passed a response to that which fixes it, and then we're stuck with that fix. So sometimes it feels like we're all shoveling against the tide, but we have to recognize the fact that they have a point of view which the General Assembly listens to frequently, and we have to respond to that.
Yeah, and if I may add, when I first got on the school committee, happy-go-lucky new school committee member thinking I'm going to change the world for Smithfield anyhow, and I quickly learned that my thought that, okay, you have a state and you have a school committee or a town, and that town is analogous to a state and the federal government. You know how the federal government has certain prescribed powers and the states can kind of do their own things within certain confines? I thought that was analogous to state and local communities. And no, as many of the experienced school committee members here will tell you, and as new members will quickly find out, that is not the case. And I had to then learn to work within the confines of RIDE, General Assembly, and several other bosses that I didn't realize as an elected official I had.
So now we're just going to go through a couple of selected pieces of different statutes. As I mentioned before, there are so many statutes, over 300 statutes, which we could actually talk about today, but your eyes would glaze, you'd become glazed donuts, and we certainly couldn't get it all in this time period. So we just wanted to pick out some which could be guardrails for you going forward. So we're going to start off with a statute which is called the Code of Management Principles and Ethical School Standards. So this is a good one to look at because it has a lot of great touchstones in it. And I think you should all take the time, new members, to look up the statute, look at it, read it through carefully, What we often advise school committees is when new school committee members come on board, consider a resolution to pass it again, just to reinforce it so everybody understands the rules of the game. I think it's a good thing to do. If not, you should have a meeting, maybe with your legal counsel or your own orientation, and actually go through the statute and see the pieces. But the relevant parts, we think, are as follows. And we think this is the most important one. Recognize that the first and greatest concern must be the educational welfare of the students. If that becomes your marker in terms of your position on the school committee and becomes the central focus of everything that you do, you cannot help to be successful as a school committee person. You'll be fine. No matter what your political orientation is, no matter what direction you'd want to go, if people consider you far right, far left, progressive, whatever, it doesn't make a difference. That becomes your focus. You have to make a good decision in favor of kids. And it becomes one of the most gratifying things that you do in this type of public office. And then to define the responsibilities, to evaluate regularly, and to engage, and without engaging in any administrative processes. One of the problems that school committee members also always have, the new members, is they come to the school committee with like a bundle of energy, and Sean said, they're gonna change the world. One of the things they don't realize, as I said before, is they're sitting on a committee, and that committee's primary duty is policy and oversight. It's not to run a district. So frequently what happens is a new school committee member gets on a school committee member, and then there's a request for 1,000 different kinds of data points that they'd like the superintendent to get together, or they want to spend a lot of time explaining their point of view on some administrative task. It's not that it's not appropriate and it's not nice to have that information, but it's, for a superintendent, a lot of that isn't relevant. And a lot of the information that you may be requesting is just extra work that you're going to make for the administration to do, because it's going to take a lot of person hours to put that information together. So if you find yourself in that position, one of the things you always want to do is sit down and talk with your chair or another senior member on your committee and say, hey, I think I want to ask for this kind of information, share it with the committee, this is the direction I'm going in, and let somebody help you either shape your request or make sure that you're not stepping on the toes of your administrators in terms of their responsibility to actually administer the district. Another ethical requirement is to establish and maintain procedures to resolve complaints and criticisms of school affairs. I've always been impressed, and I'm going to embarrass you, Richard. Richard is the chair of the school committee in Smithfield. How he has always allowed people to, any person who wants to say something at a school committee, he gives them the opportunity to come forth and explain. And I've sat through long meetings at times saying, gee, I haven't had dinner yet. I really would love to go home. And Richard always takes the time to make sure that everybody is heard. And that's one of your principal responsibilities at meetings, right? When people come and they want to be heard, your responsibility is to let them say what's important to them. Not even necessarily that you respond to them or have an answer, but give them that opportunity to vent and inform and give you input, which is going to help you make your decisions. Also, the rules of ethics require you to act only through public meetings, since individual members have no authority to bind a committee. This is a really important point, because a lot of you activists, people that, especially when you're first on the committee and you want to accomplish something, you don't realize that you can't accomplish anything without a committee vote, and on your own you have no authority at all. You have no legitimate authority. So you have to be very careful not to try to exercise authority where you don't have it, because it's going to legitimize your ability to get anything done in that school district. Because people are going to marginalize you because you're not working within the committee. So it's very important that you learn to do that. You understand what your role is. Sean?
So speaking more about role, within the General Assembly statutes, they empower the school committee with the entire care, control, and management of public school interest. That sounds pretty expansive. It sounds really broad, the entire care and control and management of public schools. But as we've been explaining throughout this morning session is that although you do have that generalized control that's vested in your local school committee, you still have to abide by those separate rules that the General Assembly has created for you. Your committee must implement federal and state laws, rules, and regulations from RIDE. So there is federal regulations, let's say, pertaining to special education. Some of those things may be a mystery to you. I know for me, when I first got on the committee, special ed law in particular was something that I did not understand or have a full appreciation for how much school districts, regardless of what school committee members might think or might want to do, are restricted by the federal government and the regulations that they promulgate. But likewise, you have state law and rules from RIDE that you're going to have to follow. And again, changing those is not merely a vote on a school committee. It's advocating at the General Assembly and at the RIDE level. And again, to reiterate this bottom piece, again, advocate, but you took that oath, and it's important that you stay within your lane and abide by the rules and regulations that you must live with until such time as they're changed.
And one point that I wanted to make on this slide as well, the first bullet point, in the law, there's a term called in pari matera, which means that you have to look at everything in context with every other statute that affects an issue. So a lot of new school committee members might look at that first bullet point and say, well, we're the king of the world, right? You're really not, because you also have to compare the responsibility and the power that you get with that section of the statute with all the rest of the enabling act for the school committees, which have plenty of limiting language, the responsibilities for superintendents, which we're going to go over quickly, and now the statutory responsibilities for principals, which the General Assembly gave them a whole bunch of rights and responsibilities in 2019, which became effective in 2020. So always keep in mind, you can't look at, some of you like to look at the laws, like DIY attorneys, which is fine, but keep in mind you have to understand the context, and you have to put it in with other statutes.
So the committee here has the overall responsibility for policy, for employment and discipline. So what does that mean? You as a body that can develop policy, you develop policy relative to how individuals may be employed within your district. So that means a hiring procedure policy, what the superintendent needs to follow, what process the superintendent needs to follow, the general guidelines of that process. And likewise, for disciplining of employees, there is a process that needs to be followed. A lot of that is dictated by state law, what rights a public employee has to due process. So when you are considering terminating an employee, you will receive a recommendation from your superintendent, and there are processes that are followed, such as a hearing before the school committee, and of course then they have appellate rights to the Rhode Island Department of Education. So if they disagree, that employee says, nope, either what I'm accused of doing is not something that happened and the superintendent's wrong, or it does not meet the level of just cause termination, which is a standard that you need to abide by within your collective bargaining agreements, they can challenge that at RIDE and then through the courts, and you could see yourself potentially overturned. But of course, that's a process that will be guided by your attorney for your school district, and they'll help you along the way. But your superintendent has administrative responsibility for employment and discipline decisions, which we'll cover in, I think, a little bit more detail later on.
One point we did want to make too is you have to understand that as a school committee, a member of a school committee, your body becomes the body basically of last resort in the school district. So what does that mean? So if there is a controversy below, teacher termination case, non-certified termination case, child suspension case from school, you become the final appeal before it later can go on or be appealed to RIDE or to courts, depending on the circumstance. So that means that you have to be untainted, because you're going to engage likely at some point in a case where you're going to have to decide facts. And the first time that you hear those facts is when both parties present them to you, and often under oath. If you meddle in the superintendent's or your principal's business as a school committee member, and people call you all the time, your constituents are going to call you all the time about how, my son was wronged by this teacher, or yeah, my son was caught with 3 drinks, but I still think he should be the quarterback of the football team. Well, it goes on and on and on, because human beings are all messy. If you don't know that now, you're going to find that out shortly in your job. If you get involved in that whole factual process, when you eventually get to be the hearing body, you can't give either side a fair hearing, and you could upset the whole apple cart. So any decision that the school committee could make ultimately could end up being overturned at RIDE or in court, and that could have profound liability issues for you. We had one case in a district where we had a non-renewal of a principal, and during the non-renewal hearing, one of the members on the school committee made a comment that, you all know what a non-renewal is, right? We're not going to extend somebody's contract. In this case, it was a principal. One of the school committee members said, off the cuff, yeah, I'm going to vote for this non-renewal because I heard from a bunch of parents, and the parents told me that this principal is not doing the right thing in the school and is doing some pretty funky things. So could have voted yes or no, but decided to add those comments. Well, that became the basis of an appeal at RIDE. Then it went to the Board of Regents. Then it went to Superior Court, and then it went to the Rhode Island Supreme Court. And luckily, the Rhode Island Supreme Court said that was an incidental thing, that really wasn't tainting the hearing. School committees hear information from people all the time. But the lesson was, it was about $120,000 in legal fees, and there was jeopardy at every single level that thankfully we won at, but that case went much further than it had to and created a lot of more angst and anxiety. So you have to think about that as a school committee member when you get involved in cases, or when you make comments like that that indicate you've been involved in a case in an inappropriate way, because of that position that you hold ultimately. But on this screen, we wanted to talk to you briefly about your responsibility in terms of finances, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But as from a general point of view, we want you to understand that you have the statutory responsibility to fund education. So what does that mean? Your position, even though you were elected by a bunch of people that were taxpayers, you don't owe your devotion by statute to that constituency group, even though you want their votes. Your real constituency and your obligation now is to adequately fund and advocate for adequate funding for education. So if you ran for the school committee to be able to tell the taxpayers that you chopped the budget to save money, you're in it for the wrong reason, really, because that's not what your position is about based on what the General Assembly tells you your responsibility is. So you have to keep that in mind, and you really have to reflect upon that. There's nothing wrong with being efficient, but your overarching goal is student education and making sure the students in your school have an adequate education. That's where it is. Remember the first rule of ethics that we pointed out to you. Always keep that in mind. That has to be your touchstone. Sean?
And another general point here is balancing competing priorities and limited resources that you find yourself with. So everyone's familiar with what a spoiler alert is. Spoiler alert, you're never going to have enough money. You're just not. For what you want to do, to what you think ought to have happened in your district, there's never going to be enough funds. When the budget cycle comes around, there's going to be talks of cuts. We can't do X, we have to limit Y, and down the road you go. So you're always going to be balancing what are, as a committee and as a community, what are our local priorities and what resources do we have to effectuate those local priorities, and how are we going to go about making sure we can accomplish as much as we can with those limited resources.
Also, when you're done with your budget, it demonstrates to what degree, and I'm talking about budget at your level, not the municipal budget, the budget that you send to the municipality that you hope is funded, whether or not education is going to be a priority in your district, right? So the interaction shouldn't be, what does the mayor or the town administrator expect us to do necessarily? But you have to look at the budget, from my point of view, as a political statement of what your district needs in terms of education. So sometimes that request can be framed in a way where you certainly can't exceed the 4% cap for state money, for local monies, but it certainly can reflect the areas that you need, how you expect that they're going to be paid, from what sources they're going to be paid, but the basic driver in the budget has to be need, not necessarily money. So if you think something that's going to result in a 4% increase as opposed to a 2% increase might be politically unpalatable, you have to disregard those thoughts, frankly, and you really have to go with what does the district need? And how do we demonstrate that it needs to be funded?
All right, so as we had mentioned, the General Assembly creates a school committee. It also creates other entities such as RIDE, or empowers individuals like the superintendent and the principals with their own standalone statutory authority. So we're going to break down those a bit right now. So you have RIDE and the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education. As I mentioned, they are created and creatures of the General Assembly, and they can issue regulations, they can enforce those regulations, and they can resolve conflicts and controversies through the hearing process at the department. So just some examples of their authority to regulate and how they do that. One is the implementation of the Basic Education Program, shorthand BEP. Educators love taking everything and putting it into a bunch of letters, and hopefully you understand what they're talking about. But that outlines the general rights that every student in Rhode Island has for an education. It outlines human capital and how that process works for school departments. Again, something that you as a school committee need to acknowledge as a reality that your superintendent, your building principals are going to need to follow, regardless of whether or not you agree with any of the fine print.
One point I wanted to make about the BP is it's actually a very readable document. You can download it from RIDE. It's about 30 pages long, but it doesn't read like 30 pages. It really would be helpful for new school committee members to get it and to read it. And it expresses what RIDE and what the General Assembly expects you to accomplish in your school district. Sure.
Medical marijuana, requirements for all medical marijuana administration to students. So there are new regulations that have been promulgated where every school authority must develop a policy and procedure relative to the administration of medical marijuana to students, which obviously this is going to come with some level of controversy, but again, something we have to live with. The protocols and procedures that officials must abide by are promulgated by the Department of Health, and we are, as school committees and school departments, required to follow that.
I was at a school committee meeting last month. So one of the things we do is when the Department of Health or the General Assembly, the General Assembly passes a law, a rule, or a regulation that requires policy development, is we usually develop a model policy that we share with a number of our districts. They kind of sandpaper it, if you will, make sure it's friendly, and then we offer it to all our clients. So we did that for medical marijuana. So month and a half ago, I was at a school committee meeting, and a school committee member who read it for the first time, which always a mistake, publicly said at the meeting, "Why do we have to pass this? This is marijuana. We don't want to be using marijuana in our schools." And so I just kept my mouth shut until the chair said, "Ben, could you please respond to that?" And the response was, the Rhode Island Department of Health and the Rhode Island Department of Education require you to do this. And the response was, why? Why? Why do we have to do that? And I said, well, just let me read the beginning of the Department of Health, it's in red, Every school authority must, so we don't have a choice. And then it's pretty descriptive as we go on past protocol. You don't have a choice. It's a rule of the game. Understand your guardrails. It's difficult for a lot of people. Yes? It's both. So the Department of Health passed the regulation, and the Board of Education then facilitated that and made it a requirement. So if you look at the Department of Health regulations, it says you shall, and it's under their general health regulations, and then RIDE buttresses that, and they require you to do it as well. So there are actually two agencies that require it at this point.
Well, RIDE is the governing body when it comes to this, my understanding.
No, Department of Health,
Does issue guidelines, but not all.
no, Department of Health can issue regulations, and they can issue regulations that deal with health to the extent that they impact on schools. And they do that all the time. Actually, if you look at that particular statute and you go on the Department of Health's website or the Secretary of State, this is part of a much broader requirement that requires a number of other things besides dispensing medical marijuana in schools or facilitating that. It tells you what your school nurses can do. It tells you what kind of examinations children have to have. It's pretty expansive. Sure.
And then we have another example, the education of homeless children and youth. And this defines when school districts are responsible for the delivery of services to homeless children. And RIDE has interpreted that to mean that if a child is deemed homeless and they are homeless within a particular town, that is their school district that they can enroll into, which does kind of create, it's a bit strange, but essentially if you're a family, you find yourself in a situation where you are homeless and let's say you had a home in Smithfield, Rhode Island, and you move to, you lose the home, you get in your car, that's all you have left, and you roll over the line into Lincoln, say, I'm going to enroll my child in Lincoln Public Schools. RIDE's going to say, they're homeless in Lincoln. Lincoln, you need to educate this child.
Pretty incredible. They have a regulation on this, a specific one, and we came across it because we had a case about a month ago where mom and dad lived in a town with their kids in school. Mom and dad went to Florida. Mom and dad came back in September of the school year, but they never enrolled the kids. Mom and dad got evicted from their apartment, and mom and dad went to live with the brother-in-law in another town in a trailer park. So they fit the definition of being homeless. But then they tried to go back to their home district and register their kids at the beginning of this school year, even though now they were living at a trailer park. Actually, it might have been in Gloucester. So the question was, do we have to enroll the kids in what was the home district? So that resulted in a hearing. But along the way, conversations with the hearing officer say, oh yeah, anywhere that they happen to be homeless, they can just pick that school. So I said, let me get this straight. So mom and dad are homeless. They put the kids in the van. They drive to a CVS in Barrington and say, here we are. We're homeless in Barrington. They can now register in Barrington. Yep, that's how we read the regulation. And then Barrington has to live with that. So we have to understand that that's the rule and that's how expansive it is. The rule was intended to protect kids and get kids in school. And RIDE doesn't care where it goes, but you guys pay the price for that. It's one of the rules of the game. And they also have the right to decide what educational laws mean. So they have the right to interpret all the educational laws that the General Assembly has passed. And when that decision gets to courts are supposed to pay attention to RIDE's point of view, because the reason why you have that rule is it's assumed that RIDE is kind of authority in the education world, and they should have the right to be able to decide what the statutes that they deal with all the time actually mean. It's very similar to the federal level, where they have the same kind of authority. So deference is usually given to the agency. So if it's the Department of Labor and they decide to a decision what a labor law means, courts usually give them deference. Same thing happens with RIDE. So we have to understand that RIDE's perspective, like driving to a CVS in Barrington, becomes important because courts are going to pay a lot of attention to that, and they're likely going to enforce their decisions. But basically, any decision that you make, and there are two separate appeal statutes, specific statutes, that say anything that you decide can be appealed to RIDE. So frequently, Sean and I get phone calls from the individual who's responsible to set up hearing offices that said, hey, mom just called about student suspension or whatever for one of the districts you represent, Ben or Sean. Can you be available tomorrow afternoon for a hearing, evidentiary hearing? Because we have to decide whether or not the school committee made the right decision in suspending this child or did not register this child. And we have to kind of be ready for that because that's when they schedule the hearing. But these happen all the time. So you're hardly ever the last decision if someone doesn't like your decision. There's quite an appeal mechanism. And they ultimately basically can turn over any decision that you make if they think that you've made it in the wrong way. Now, they don't frequently do that, but they do essentially get the final word unless we go to court. Not me. So their principal means of enforcement and directives is they can withhold money. So in various scenarios, they have the right to report to the general treasurer and say, this district owes money to that district, or this district is violating the law in our opinion, and tell the general treasurer to withhold state aid to you. So they have quite a big club that they could use to enforce their decisions if they need to. Also, the other enforcement mechanism is they can appeal their decision if we're not paying attention to it ultimately to Superior Court or Supreme Court in some circumstances and get enforcement action through the courts. So they do have a pretty big stick that they could use, a pretty big club, if we don't want to pay attention to what they do. So I want to talk a bit about superintendent's rights, and many times you think because you employ and you hire a superintendent that you kind of have control as a traditional master-servant relationship, attorneys call it, over your superintendent. So to a degree that's true. You evaluate them, right? You tell them whether or not they're meeting the district goals that you guys have set up. To a degree you give them input. But you have to understand that superintendents have their own statute, their own enabling act, which tells them what they must do besides. And just as you have to have fidelity to the law, in order for them to hold on to their superintendent certificate, they have to have fidelity to state law and regulation as well. And sometimes that's different than what you'd like to see. So you put your superintendents in a vice, which frankly is not appropriate. You have to respect the level of responsibility that they have as well. So it becomes a relationship, hopefully, of mutual trust and mutual cooperation with both sides understanding what their lane is and their responsibility. Sometimes the way I see superintendents, on the other hand, try to invade the powers of the school committee is superintendents will create policy and say, here, pass this policy, here, pass that policy. And the school committee saying, oh, okay, yeah, we'll pass this week and we'll do that. We're going to do 10 policies this year, so we're going to do this. And you abdicate your responsibility to a superintendent then. Your power is always going to be in policy because that's going to tell the district how it's going to run consistent with the law, right? So you have to guide your power jealously, but you also have to respect that the superintendent is going to have a degree of power that they have to exercise as well, and you shouldn't step on the superintendent's toes. John?
And some of those powers, well, a lot of those powers are outlined in the state law. Some of them are here. I'll just highlight a few of them: to administer the personnel function of the school department, to comply with the provisions of federal and state law. So again, you can see right there, comply with the provisions of federal and state law. There's an independent statutory duty that the superintendent must follow to comply with all other federal and state laws. So regardless of what you might think is right in the moment, as a school committee, you can't direct, if you do direct the superintendent to not comply with the law, that superintendent it simply just can't take that action. Also be risking their own license as a superintendent in the state. Under the general laws, have their own independent authority, that they shall be the educational administrators and managers of their schools and shall supervise the operation and management of that school property. And that's also subject to the supervision of the superintendent.
So this is significant because in 2019, the General Assembly passed this statute, and for the first time, they gave principals statutory powers. So to the extent that they granted these powers, the General Assembly has put them on a par with you and with superintendents, and we have to respect that. Unfortunately, when that statute was passed, I think it was passed from the point of view of what do big school districts need and how do big school districts operate. Well, most of you are not, in this state, are not members of big school districts. You're relatively flat. You really don't have this big, long structure, and you don't need your principals to act like mini superintendents. But nevertheless, the General Assembly created that as a rule for us, and we have to live with it. The pictures on the right, principals for a long time complained that they never got really to decide what the ingredients in the soup were. They were just given the ingredients in the soup and said, here, make something good. So what I always tell principals now, especially the ones that used to whine, because we do these presentations for the Principals Association, is congratulations, now you're responsible from personnel to light bulbs to toilet seats, because that's what the statute requires. They have a lot of responsibility. And they're still coping with that from 2019, how to actually do that, because there's no infrastructure for them to be able to do that. You have all that in your central office for smaller districts. We're going to quickly go through some elements of the Reform Act now.
Right. So school-based management, so the principal, in consultation with professionals within that building, are set to manage and promote participatory decision-making. So the idea here is that you want the building principal to collaborate with different stakeholders throughout the community and those that are going to live under whatever rules that they may want to promote within that particular school building for the purposes of developing educational policy. So they're going to be evaluating school personnel. They're going to be initiating performance review plans for school and individual teachers. They're going to be preparing their particular school's budget for review at the superintendent level and then, of course, go up to the school committee. Recommending, this is a big one, recommending to the superintendent the hiring of all personnel assigned to the school, and on the flip side, recommending the termination of all personnel assigned to their school. So what I'm seeing more and more now when we have these termination proceedings, I'm going back and saying, superintendent, do you have a recommendation from your building principal that this individual needs to be disciplined and or terminated? And what are the grounds from that principal's perspective for that discipline?
So now let's talk about hiring and firing. The good news is you still get to fire people. Congratulations. The bad news is that has the hiring function, which you used to do, has now shifted to superintendents. So they get to do the good part, you get to do the bad part. You can thank your General Assembly. So they can appoint principals, administrators, and other personnel not assigned to individual schools. On the other hand, if there is a personnel decision that's made that affects a local school, the principal has to be basically the prime mover in consultation with the SIT team or some other group or committee that you set up in, or that's set up in a local school site. That has to result in a recommendation. That recommendation goes to the superintendent. Superintendent then acts as if he was a school committee or she was a school committee from the days of old before 2019 and make those decisions. So that has now fully shifted. That's still somewhat of a controversy for a lot of school committees. They don't like to have been divested of that power, but we are where we are. as I've mentioned a number of times, still your power is in policy, because even under the Education Reform Act, you get to decide how that works. You get to make that whole roadmap up through your policy. So if you don't have one, you want your committee to have a subcommittee on policy where you can raise issues and you could determine what policy is going to look like. Your legal counsel can help you with policies. Your superintendent can help you with policies. And there are a number of districts across the state where they've really focused on policies and they have some really good models. Is Mary Ann Roll here from Lincoln? She is, right? Yeah, here she is. So she led the subcommittee in Lincoln, and over the last 2 years, she's gone through every single policy that Lincoln has, save maybe 5 or 6 at this point. So Lincoln becomes a very good model for you to generally look at if you want to get an idea of what a decent policy looks like, because they're well thought through. And they've run that model. They have a subcommittee that meets every single month and goes through policies and changes them. So where they have power, they exercise it appropriately. It's something that you all should do. It's a good focus for a new school committee member. Some of the policies you want to look at are hiring, compensation, evaluations, employee discipline, SIT committee criteria. As I mentioned, the SIT team informs the principal on a number of decisions. But you set the policy. So you should do that. You should be involved in that function.
You're going to need to learn to work as a group and through consensus on your school committee, but eventually that's going to bubble up through your community as well. You're going to have to work with your town council to get to a point where you can have a working budget. But remember, you were elected to join a committee, not an administrative position. Again, working by consensus. You have no power under the law to act on your own as an individual school committee member. Your power comes from consensus making and priority in policy making, where you can exercise your power through that policy.
As Mary Ann has said to me a number of times at school committee meetings, first thing you have to learn how to do is math. If you can't count to a majority, you're not going to get anything done. So you have to be able to count to be successful, right? Told you I'd quote you. Okay, municipal financing. Just a word about this, because people really get frustrated with municipal financing. The way the General Assembly set the system up is you have a body called usually a town council. Their responsibility is to adequately fund city services, including education, and to ration the funds between them, but also to pay attention to their constituents who are taxpayers. Your responsibility, as we mentioned before, is to advocate for education in terms of the budget, right? Not necessarily to pay attention to what the tax rate is, even though it could have a negative impact on whether or not you're elected. So we don't want you to do something foolish in terms of slashing your budget, but your first goal should be what's educationally necessary for my school district to adequately educate kids, not what the impact on taxes are going to be. So understanding that, and you come from different perspectives, there's a tension that's built into the statute of who's responsible to do what on the town or the municipal side, and who's responsible to do what on the school side. So it often looks like a fight, but the intent is to create this tension between the two parties, and hopefully you come up with a fair budget that adequately funds education in your town. But it looks like a fight. And it's intended to look like a fight because both sides are advocating for something. So don't be frustrated by the fact that your town council won't fully fund you. That's really not their job. Okay, their job is much broader than that. Yours is pretty well focused. But if you understand that it's intended to be a fight, and that's the rule of the game, I think it tends to ease a lot of your frustration. Our union colleagues. So you have to have a relationship with your union colleagues. As Anna just told me, we were talking about this. Unions are not going away. They happen to be very strong in the state of Rhode Island, so we have to learn to live with them. We have to learn to deal with them. But we also have to understand, even though they have this veneer of representing education. The NEA in particular likes to put that out there, that they're educationally oriented. And to a degree they are, but that's not their primary job. Their primary job is to protect their members and to get their members what they view as a fair raise and fair benefits every single year, which could be, and usually is, substantially different than your point of view when you look at the resources that you have. So again, this is another situation where neither side is wrong or bad, but there's a tension that's created. It's created in the Michelson Act, which gives them the right, teachers the right to bargain, and non-certified governmental employees the right to bargain. Understand the tension and why it's there, and it becomes a lot less frustrating. Don't expect them to do what's right for education. Expect them to do what's right for their members, and then you won't be disappointed in what they do. Just some quick final thoughts, and then if we have time, we'll take any questions.
So from my perspective, as a former school committee member, a lot of this at first glance can be frustrating because your arms and hands are really tied. And there might be some issues that you want to really implement within your school department that either you can't or that you don't necessarily have the votes on the committee. Getting to that majority, that vote counting, you might not be able to get all the way there. Express your point of view. This certainly is not a session in telling you that you can't have an opinion about anything. Express your point of view on the committee. Be respectful, of course, and don't get all twisted up if you lose a vote. Because as a committee, your ethical responsibility is for the best interests of those students in that district, and you're not going to win every vote. That's the practical reality of life in a democracy, right? But don't get all twisted up. 95% of the time, you're going to work together with your committee, and it's going to be a 5-to-1 vote. If your committee's bigger, it's going to be, you're all going to be working together. And on those votes where you do have a disagreement, it's okay to have a disagreement, express your point of view, but then on the next vote, when everyone's all together again, you move together as one committee. And if you do lose a vote, it's your job as a school committee member to not stand in the way of that decision being made, being implemented by the school department. They have a job to do. The vote's been taken. We move on to the next day.
Okay, this quote kind of speaks for itself. Since we're at the end of our presentation, does anybody have any quick questions? Yeah, you could ask your superintendent to have different certified people or non-certified people come make presentations to the school committee, and you can interact with them in that kind of forum. That's always helpful. And when you decide how you're going to negotiate, one of the things you consider is what kind of committee do we want to put together that can reflect the school committee's wants and desires and how that's expressed. So in some districts, given the relationship, they tell the superintendent or superintendent attorney, you go do all the work, these are your directions. In other ones, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 or more members of the school committee that sit on a negotiating team for everything or certain issues, and that gives them an opportunity to relate to them in a good way. Also, I think unions know the kind of what your intent is when you vote on different kinds of issues that send them different kind of signals. So have that in your mind. And I don't think there's anything wrong with union members, maybe the union president. In a lot of districts, president of the teachers union shows up and comments on policy or comments on different issues. And that kind of information can be invited. And that's very helpful too.
But kept in the context of committee work as opposed to individual meetings with.
Absolutely. Yep. You don't want union people thinking that they could chop the knees off the superintendent by going right to the school committee, because you really undercut their authority and the morale in the district. It requires a certain membership component to it, including certain stakeholders from the community, and it becomes one of the principal bodies that the principal must pay attention to in terms of input when they make all their decisions, and it becomes part of their participatory decision making. So it's intended to draw in opinions from not only the certified union, but also from a broad spectrum of shareholders, shareholders in the system. But school committee gets to pass the policy on how those sit teams are constructed and when, and to a large degree, the kind of people that sit on them, how often they have to be changed, the number of people in different areas, to some degree, they are required by legislation. But you have a lot of authority in that area. So one of the things you want to do is look at your policy in your district and see if they're really going to reflect your district when they actually inform the principal of their decisions. Is that helpful?
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
I'm gonna ask it again. In your policy for sit teams, there is no state law that states that a school committee member could not be on a sit team within your school district. Is that correct?
That's correct. However,
I know it does not look right, but
when you're elected to a school committee, you carry a certain cloak with you, right? And that gives you a lot of enhanced authority. So if a parent looks at you now as a representative of the community, union members look at you as a representative of the community, and that might give outsized participation by you on a committee. So my point of view, although it's not required, is it's better off not to serve on PTOs or PTAs or committees outside school committee subcommittees, just because it creates this outsized influence, and that could tend to skew what happens at that meeting. And you sometimes deprive other people of the ability to give input. So that could happen, and it's likely to happen. Also, when you speak as a school committee member, you're not speaking for the school committee, unless the school committee specifically authorized it and asked you to give that opinion. So there's great potential for confusion with that. But can you do it? Yes. Any other questions? Yes.
It's not really a question, it's more of a comment about the sit. It's like you have all these requirements, but you can't require people to volunteer, right? And so our sit teams, like right now
Yeah.
in our district, we're in Southeast, and the high school sit team is got an expansive membership, and it's a wonderful, but we have 5 other schools in the district, and they have like nobody on their sit teams.
That's a very practical problem. You're right.
Right? So it's law, but you can't legislate people to volunteer.
General Assembly assumed that everybody, so all jump on that sit team. It's what we want to do tomorrow afternoon. It's true.
The bill was modeled after Massachusetts, and my counterpart in Mass says it's a problem there too. They call those school councils, and a lot of schools just don't have the wherewithal to put together a school council. So in absence of that, the principal pretty much does unilaterally what he or she wants to do.
discussion around open meetings, and this is just one of, over the years, been my concern, is how, as school committee members, how are we able to communicate with each other outside of public meetings, in ways that are realistic?
So you all do that, and you all break the law all the time anyway.
And I know
You can ask Adam Roach this question. He's an excellent attorney from the Attorney General's office, and I think what he's going to tell you is when you talk to one member, and then another member talks to another member, and another member talks to another member, and you get to a majority, you've created a rolling quorum. And if anybody finds out about that, especially your political enemies, you know that they'll file a complaint against you. First time the Attorney General's office will say, hey, you probably didn't know about that, don't do it again. The second time, you will be sanctioned. So you have to be careful about that. What I advise people is there's nothing wrong with 2 school committee members to get together at any given time and talk. The problem that you have is when those members now propagate that information to other members, right? And you create essentially a quorum. It's really important in my mind to have your superintendent send you a weekly update for information, so you have information on what's going on in the district. A lot of superintendents do that with the newsletter that goes out, say, on a Thursday or a Friday, so you know. And then based on that information, if you want to call one member and talk about it. I would stop at that member and be careful. But you're right. But we know the law is broken all the time, every day. Yes, ma'am.
So as a chair,
No, you can, you just can't talk to a majority. And you can't talk to people in rotation, so you create a majority. But what you can do, if you want to send information out to the school committee, like the superintendent, a lot of chairs will send a general email out to the whole school committee and say, please do not respond to this. This is just for your information at this point. We'll talk about it at a school committee meeting.
If it's not a formal meeting, you all end up at the hockey rink to watch the team play, that's not a violation. We're going to have a presentation from Adam Roach, who's a Special Assistant Attorney General for the Open Meeting Law and APRA, right after lunch, well, the second presentation after lunch. So a lot of those questions will be appropriate at that time. He'll be able to answer what the issues are. We had questions before this meeting. If a majority of the school committee showed up at this meeting, did it violate the open meeting law? We got an opinion that said, no, it doesn't. But he'll be in a position to answer virtually all of those questions. And a lot of the school districts and school committees have been subject to a lot of APRA requests. He'll go over what the APRA law is. It's access to public records and what your obligations and duties are. So I want to thank, if you've got an open meeting question, there'll be an expert here in the second half of the program to answer that. I want to thank Ben and Sean. We're going to take a quick break.